Let's bring in now the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese. Mr Albanese, good morning to you.
Good morning, Michael.
Firstly, I want to ask you about the Doherty Institute targets. Do you support the large-scale reopening of much of Australian society with restrictions when needed once we hit 80%?
Yes, I do.
OK, and do you see lockdowns as being part of that mix?
Well, the national plan provides for only restricted, targeted lockdowns. I support the national plan. It has proposals at 70% and 80%. It is, as it is written, there is scope there for lockdowns, but targeted if they're absolutely necessary. OK,
so 80% is agreed to by you in terms of borders reopening, limitations lifted on most Australians.
Well, that's there in the national plan, and Labor supports the national plan. No one wants to see lockdowns there for one day more than necessary. But we need to remember the reason why we are having lockdowns right now is firstly that quarantine wasn't fixed. These have all arisen from outbreaks, from a failure to have purpose-built quarantine. This current outbreak throughout Australia arises from one limo driver taking a foreign air crew unvaccinated, without a mask, to hotel quarantine. And some months later, the whole of New South Wales is in lockdown. We're in Canberra in lockdown. Melbourne, it's been quite catastrophic, the direct consequence. And the reason why the consequences of that failure are so great, of course, is because of a failure on vaccines, a failure to get that supply that was needed earlier this year.
I want to talk about supply issues and the rollout in just a moment, but based on that 80% threshold, which seemingly everybody now agrees to, except WA and Queensland in some respects.
That's not right.
What do you say?
Well, that's not right, Michael.
Well, let's start with the WA Premier, Mark McGowan. He is pretty much committed to trying to reach COVID zero. Sharon Lewin for Doherty, the institute behind the modelling, says that is not possible. That'll be out of the equation once we hit 80%.
Well, Mark McGowan has kept West Australians safe. Mark McGowan agreed with the national plan. It does provide for safeguards in that national plan. And I find it quite extraordinary that the Prime Minister has basically described West Australians and Queenslanders as somehow being cave people, wanting to stay in the cave. The reason why there are restrictions is because of the Prime Minister's failure to secure enough vaccines, including for West Australians and Queenslanders, and a failure to build purpose-built quarantine. Premier Palaszczuk proposed the Wellcamp site last October. 10 months ago, we could have had purpose-built quarantine operating for the whole of this year in Queensland at that site. In Western Australia, there were proposals, for example, at Exmouth. I know that the West Australian Minister McTiernan, has spoken to me, Alana, about the need for quarantine facilities for ag workers and for others. The fact is that the reason why there are restrictions today is because the Prime Minister failed on those two fundamental jobs, quarantine and vaccines. OK,
and also we had the Queensland Deputy Premier Stephen Miles saying recently that even if those targets were met later in the year, Queensland wouldn't necessarily reopen its border to New South Wales. I guess the question I have to you is it incumbent as Labor leader for you to get the message to those Labor states to come on board as part of the national project once 70% and certainly 80% is reached?
Well, they are on board and they've done a fantastic job. And I tell you what is incumbent upon national leadership. It's to bring the whole country forward as a united country and not to try to divide. And Scott Morrison now is trying to distract from his own problems and his own failures by trying to divide the country, by trying to set state against state. And what the premiers have been doing is keeping their state safe. And remember, during last year's Queensland campaign, Scott Morrison visiting Queensland, lecturing Queenslanders, saying, open up the borders. Of course, the Queenslanders voted overwhelmingly for Anastasia Palaszczuk and for her government. And remember, just months ago here, Michael, in June, the Prime Minister standing up and congratulating Gladys Berejiklian for not taking action, for keeping everything open. And guess what? Months later, New South Wales is still in lockdown and it's spread everywhere. The truth is that the action that Gladys Berejiklian didn't take has had real consequences for people. If you don't take the appropriate action at the right time as a matter of urgency, then what we know is that the lockdowns will be more strict and will go for longer. And that's what we're seeing in New South Wales.
Okay.
No one wants to see it.
Just before you go, you've based a lot of your political strategy this year on criticising the slow rollout. It has been agonisingly slow. Even government MPs concede that. But do you worry by the time we get to early next year, with 80% hopefully being reached, if not more, restrictions largely off, lockdowns hopefully a thing of the past, not really having much of a political strategy to run with?
Oh, Michael, I want Australians to get vaccinated. I want restrictions to be lifted, and I want to have a debate about what Australia's future is. That's why we've already put out plans for building back stronger, our National Reconstruction Fund. That's why I spoke at the National Press Club in June, saying that we would have a jobs summit, saying that we would have a full employment white paper. That's why I've said we'll create Jobs and Skills Australia. That's why I'm talking about what sort of Australia we can both imagine for the future that's stronger and then set about creating it. We've already got those plans out there. We'll continue to roll them out, and I hope that we're as successful as possible. But what the question will be is when vaccination rates are up and restrictions are lifted, who do you trust to take Australia forward? The party of workers' rights, the party of giving people a fair go, the party of Medicare to look after your ongoing health, or a government that basically has talked itself up, that didn't deliver in terms of the vaccine rollout, that hasn't delivered purpose-built quarantine and doesn't have a plan for the future.
Anthony Albanese, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks very much, Michael.